All right, the Japanese elections, episode 129 of the Capital Cable. With us, Govella, Luck, Yo, to unpack it all that and more on the next Capital Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in DC. Good evening to those of you in Korea or Northeast Asia or Japan, as the case may be. Good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 129th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capital Cable, the Japanese elections. And with us to unpack it, three of the very best. And let me just bring them in one by one. First up, Christy Govella. And let me just introduce her properly. She is a senior advisor and Japan chair at CSIS, an associate professor of Japanese politics and international relations at the University of Oxford, with a whole host of accolades, other accomplishments. Look up her bio online. She's been on before, and she has been brilliant. She holds a PhD and MA in political science from UC Berkeley and a BA in political science and Japanese from the University of Washington, Seattle. Go Huskies. Christy, Dr. Govella, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right, terrific. All right, next up, and I don't know if I said BA or MA for UCB, but just to be clear, Berkeley the graduate degrees, Washington, UW, the undergrad, right there. So I just wanted to be correct and on record there. All right. Next up, you're a Pac-10 person through and through, although it doesn't exist anymore. Pac-12 is the case, maybe.
The world has changed.
So I'm a Pac-12 guy myself, and it's depressing. All right, that's a separate episode on the Pac-12 and its demise. All right, next up, welcome again to this show, Christy. All right, Philip Luck. Phil Luck. Dr. Luck is director of the CSIS Economics Program and Scholl Chair in International Business. He served in government in the Biden-Harris administration as the deputy chief economist at the U.S. Department of State. Lots of accolades and accomplishment as well. Tenure in academia. He's a long time economic guru, as they say, and he graduated with honors in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and an MSc and PhD in economics from University of California, Davis, UCD. All right, Phil, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, and go Minutemen. We're going to do it.
That's right. Outstanding. All right, outstanding. There's a theme developing here. No Victor, so we don't have to focus on his, I guess, cynical attitude towards the New York Giants. It liberates us on the sports front. All right, there we go. Excellent. All right, last but not least, of course, Dr. Andrew Yo. He's a professor of politics at the Catholic University in Washington and a senior fellow and SK Foundation chair at Brookings at the Institution Center for East Asia Politics. Lots of publications to his name. Very interesting background in terms of work on East Asia, North Korea, all that good stuff. And of course, he received his PhD in government from Cornell and a BA in psychology and international studies, magna cum laude from Northwestern University. And to Phil's point, go Wildcats.
Go Wildcats and Big Ten, although we can go on forever too about why the Big Ten is like proliferating like crazy. So that's a conversation for another day.
That is true. And, we did have a guest on our show way back when, Dennis McDonough, who at the time I think was a board member of the NCAA. So I think there's a McDonough episode in our future coming up. So there we go. Yeah. All right. Outstanding. All right. Thanks to all of our guests for being here. It is a really fantastic panel on a very, very important topic. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it to Professor Adele and Govella and ask, can you just give us the laydown and unpack for us these recent elections in Japan that have seemed to have been a very big victory for the LDP? But I don't want to put my own color into the commentary. But the floor is yours, Dr. Govella. Thanks again for the show. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks so much, Mark. So just to give the basics of the election, this was a huge development for Japan. So on February 8, we saw the results of a snap election, and this was a huge gamble by Prime Minister Takaichi. She was basically taking the bet that her personal popularity with the people and her sky-high approval ratings, like in the 70% range, could carry her very unpopular party to victory. The Liberal Democratic Party had really faltered in the last two elections. It had lost its majority in both houses. Their approval ratings were somewhere in the low 30s or high 20% range. So, this was a big gamble, and it really paid off on the 8th. So the LDP actually brought home the biggest victory in 70 years. It was the biggest electoral victory ever seen. They won a supermajority on their own in the lower house, which is the most powerful house of parliament. And so, they've had a complete reversal of fortunes. And on the other side, the political opposition in Japan really had a terrible election and really seems to have basically disintegrated in the face of a lot of political fluidity in Japan. So what does this mean? It gives Takaichi a huge mandate. Now the question is, what is she going to use it for? It was mostly an election about domestic political issues, like normal, like in most countries. So voters were thinking about the economy. They're hoping she can lead them to a brighter future. But it has enormous implications for foreign policy, of course, in terms of relations with the U.S., Korea, China, etc. So I'm happy to get into those as well.
All right, outstanding. Let me just, before you get into this, let me take one step back for those of us who don't follow Japan as closely as you do. Why did this happen? You really point out this interesting dichotomy that, casual observers are following the press of her personal popularity and the LDP's lack of popularity, and the former prevailed in this election, as you just outlined. Why did that occur?
So, Prime Minister Takaichi has been popular since she came to office. She's the first female prime minister in Japan. She's really surprised a lot of people with the charisma and personality she's brought to the prime ministership, which has been, I think, a welcome change of pace from the traditional LDP leadership. She's managed to really communicate with younger voters and new voters on social media. So I think there is a lot of momentum behind her as a person, and that was really part of the story. The second part of the story was really about the failure of the opposition. And so in Japan, the largest opposition party and actually the LDP's ex-coalition partner decided to merge and create a new party called the Centrist Reform Alliance. And so they were making their own gamble that they could unite sort of more center voters, in contrast to Takaichi, who is considered to be rather right-leaning, and that they could bring together a new support base. But in the end, they ended up alienating their traditional voter base and also failing to attract any new voters. And, their leadership is quite old. They really didn't have a compelling message or a strategy. So I think it's really the result of those two things, Takaichi's popularity and then also just a really bad bet on the part of the opposition.
Okay, fascinating. And then to get to the questions that you posed in your first intervention, she's got this political capital, the LDP, the prime minister. What are her plans? What are Prime Minister Takaichi's plans for said political capital, and how are they going to use it? And maybe let's start with the domestic first, and then work our way out. Over to you.
Sure. Sure. Like I said, this election was mostly about domestic economic issues. So Japan has been having a hard time recently. For average Japanese citizens, they're experiencing inflation for the first time in several decades, particularly high prices for things like rice. They're also experiencing a weak yen, which has made various other things expensive. So, daily life and economic issues have really been top of mind for Japanese citizens. So I think that many people are probably hoping that Takaichi's first priority will be to turn to these economic issues. She's has some proposals about reducing the consumption tax on food temporarily, and basically trying to combine short-term stimulus efforts with longer-term efforts to rejuvenate the Japanese economy, invest in strategic industries, etc. So that's a big part of the domestic platform. There's also a bit about foreigner-related issues. There have been increasing concerns about immigration, over tourism, purchases of land by foreigners, et cetera, that have basically made voters unhappy. So she also has that on the agenda. But then if we think about foreign policy issues more broadly, There are, of course, a host of defense issues that she's very passionate about, and I think we'll talk more about those probably when we get into thinking about implications for the U.S. and the region. But she's already signaled that she wants to rethink Japan's 3 strategic documents, which basically define its national security strategy and defense plans. She's already accelerated Japan's increase in defense spending to 2% of GDP and is expected to increase it further. And there are going to be a host of changes around defense that will basically enhance Japan's security posture. I think a lot of these are really in line with the demands that the Trump administration is making of Japan and other allies. So that will probably be welcome news. She also used to be economic security minister, so she has a lot of plans on that front. And happy to talk more about those. And on economics in general, of course, she's encountering a delicate and evolving situation with the U.S. on trade. And so we've already seen that Japan has announced the first 3 deals under their $550 billion investment framework just recently. And so we're expected that she's going to, steer Japan towards implementing that trade deal and trying to navigate whatever trials and tribulations come on the trade front as far as the U.S. or other developments are concerned. So it's a huge agenda. And, now that they have the supermajority, there are also rumblings about, revising the Japanese constitution or doing other things that really aren't possible in many political moments. So I think the real test for her is how to prioritize and sequence this agenda. And not to let people down because expectations are sky high, both domestically and on the foreign policy front.
All right, outstanding. Really fantastic intervention. Let me follow up and one last question, and you're teasing it. You're doing a great job of transitioning over to Dr. Luck, who will be up next here shortly. Implications, just big picture, for the U.S.-Japan relationship. You went through a bucket of issues in your intervention, but bottom line here, bottom line up front, I guess, is what does this do going forward for the relationship between the Prime Minister and President Trump, and of course the U.S.-Japan alliance in the next couple of months here?
So Takaichi's victory definitely comes as welcome news to many in the U.S., including President Trump. President Trump actually endorsed her prior to the election and congratulated her immediately afterward on social media. They got off to a good start with their October meeting and clearly have built some positive rapport. But he's also expecting her to deliver on a lot of the potential and on a lot of his expectations on trade and on security. So I think it's a welcome development in the sense that Takaichi now has the flexibility and the potential to, navigate Japan through this international environment and through U.S. expectations. But I think that, it's a tall order. I think on defense and the U.S.-Japan alliance, there's a lot to look forward to in the sense that Takaichi is trying to have Japan step up and do more on security. I mentioned increasing defense spending. There's an understanding among Japanese elite these days that 2% of GDP is really the new floor for Japanese defense spending, and that they will have to increase it further. Getting up to the 5% that is expected by the Trump administration may require some creative accounting, but I think that, they're up for that challenge. I think that she's also looking at increasing, substantive cooperation with the U.S., acquiring new capabilities, et cetera. And also, thinking about strengthening relationships with other U.S. allies and partners. She has explicitly mentioned, for example, Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, Europe, et cetera. So I think that on the alliance front, this is a welcome development, and many people are hoping that, she will push forward on these defense issues because she's known to be passionate about them.
All right, outstanding. Thanks for the really great opening salvo here on the Capitol Cable. Let's go over to Dr. Locke. Phil, I hear Dr. Novella talking about trade deal. I hear economic security. I hear all sorts of economic issues. I think skull chair. I think Dr. Locke. So implications in terms of let's take them in turn. Number one, U.S.-Japan economic relationship, which is really huge in terms of moving the overall relationship. Two, the region, right? Implications there. And obviously, three, domestically, which is of paramount import to the LDP leadership itself. The floor is yours, Phil.
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to letting people down and high expectations, it's exactly when you want an economist to come in and explain how difficult all this is going to be. Yeah, no, I mean, completely
You've
agree with everything.
defined my entire athletic career there, in addition to the economic stuff.
Yes.
All right, there you are.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think look, it's a huge win. But as Chrissy sort of clearly laid out, enormous number of priorities on and a lot of this is around economics, right? I mean, the Japan has not sort of. I'll take it from back to front a little bit.
Yeah.
Again, Japan has not experienced inflation for a very long time. That is a problem. I mean, you actually do need some small inflation to basically allow prices to adjust, and that's like economists really like that, and so it's a good thing macroeconomically that they're starting to get out of that. But from a consumer standpoint, they just have no experience with prices going up for an incredibly long time. And to the point about the weak exchange rate, this is really challenging people's affordability. That's going to be a huge challenge. The problem is that's one of the hardest challenges to fix, right? That's something that basically every administration comes in with big goals about that, and almost all fail to do anything really that meaningful in that area. There's things you can do, but it's just a monumental task. At the same time, as Christy pointed out, huge priorities to do additional spending, everything from, investing in critical industries, semiconductors, all sorts of things like that, making sure they protect industries that are under increasing threat from China, everything from, again, semiconductors to chemical production, investing in their economic security, which tends to not be growth promoting. Those tend to be sort of a trade-off. And then, of course, defense spending, right? So all of this is going to cost a lot of money. Japan's already has a lot of debt. It's if you just look at the raw numbers, it kind of overstates their debt just because of the way their system works. But they still have some of the largest debt burden of sort of, especially for advanced democracies. So in a lot of ways, they have a lot of the same problems we all do. They have a populace that's not overly happy with the economic situation, a lot of competing spending priorities, and not a huge amount of space to actually spend on it. So that's on the domestic side. I mean, again, the huge win is great. It'll probably free some things up, but it's also it makes expectations high, and it's going to be really hard to deliver on those.
And Phil, just one really quick, fast follow on domestic side. Just really quick question: overall health of the Japanese economy. How does that play into this here?
I mean, I think it's a relatively, putting aside all the challenges, it's a relatively, stable economy. I think you probably have some opportunity for growth in the future. Again, from a macroeconomic standpoint, it's really good that we're starting to get a little bit of like the rigidity in prices going away. There are huge challenges. The demographics are not good. There's a lot of challenges that it has, but I think there's reasons for some optimism there. But again, the challenges are huge. I would also just say, bilaterally, I think they're in probably one of the best positions relative to a lot of our other partners. They have the $500 billion agreement. They've been the first to sort of make real tangible investments. Just came out a few days ago, about 36 billion in sort of investments that are going to be happening. They're still concerned, that that's not fast enough. But candidly, I think they're putting more pressure on the Koreans and others than there is pressure on them at the moment. There's not as many sort of other bilateral irritants, I think, with the US. So, for instance, with the Europeans, the Koreans, the Indians, and many others, they're adopting digital services and digital market regulation that's really at odds with the US priorities. Japan is taking a much more nuanced approach, I think, something that's much more palatable. I just don't think that's going to be as much of an issue. And they have real opportunities to sort of show a huge amount of value to this administration, whether it be sort of in the critical minerals processing and sector, which they're sort of ahead of us on, whether it's their sort of investment relationships in Southeast Asia, whether it's shipbuilding or semiconductor production. There's a lot of areas where I think they can sort of show themselves to be a really valuable economic partner. I mean, not that all of our partners are really valuable, but they have a really excellent sort of position there. I forget your middle question. I went first and last.
No, it's all right. Just let me take the thread, because you answered you really painted a great picture here. Let me just take it slightly different direction. These trade deals themselves, recently announced. How does that fit with the rest of the picture that you're painting, which is, I would call it cautiously optimistic in terms of its economic relationship with Washington going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I think so. I mean, again, it's nobody's overly happy with the way that Washington's behaving, but, I think Japan has done a very good job of sort of managing this. They've done a good job of sort of getting for their key sectors at least comparable tariff rates to its key competitors and partners, whether it's in the Europe or Korea. Something that I'm sure your audience may follow, but others may not. They actually, before this tariff war, they had about a 2.5% disadvantage to Korea because our free trade agreement with Korea on autos. Now they're at the exact same level. So Toyota is now comparable to Korean producers. And then of course we'll see when the IEEPA decision is probably going to come out this Friday. I don't expect that to sort of result in a big push to reopen any of these agreements. Pretty much all the partners I've talked to are very happy to just let sleeping dogs lie for the moment. And largely that's because the things that are going to be decided by the Supreme Court, these IEEPA tariffs, have nothing to do with auto tariffs, steel tariffs, semiconductor tariffs, pharmaceutical tariffs. So the stuff that they are the most impactful is sort of not on the table for those things, which is an important distinction.
Okay, and then these investment deals that they've struck, your thoughts early, and then I'm going to take it over to Andrew.
Yeah, I'll be really quick on this. I think they're doing a very good job in some sense. I think it's very clear they're moving they're moving quickly enough while being deliberate is the way I'm viewing this. And they're really only investing in things that they were going to invest in anyways. So out of the 36 billion that just came out 2 days ago, 33 billion is for natural gas investments. That, natural gas will continue to be a good bet in the United States for a long time. Of course, there's a little of uncertainty around tariffs, but generally speaking, that's a good investment. Some of it was for an LNG port, and some of it's for basically a minerals deposit. So I think they're doing a good job there. I think as long as they can continue to use this as an opportunity to, make the investments they wanted to make, provide the administration a incentive to cut red tape that would otherwise stop those things, I think that can be beneficial. And again, I think no one's the 550 billion or 500 billion is not going to cross the line over the next year or so, but I think they're doing a good job at making sure this works for them.
All right, outstanding. All right, thanks, Phil. Really interesting insights there. Andrew, over to you. Thanks for being patient with us, but there's a reason we have you batting in the third hole here. It's because we want you to obviously comment on any of the thoughts you might have had from the previous interventions, but also if you could start to bring us towards the Korean Peninsula and their thoughts. They obviously watch the Japanese elections closely. It's always of interest in Korea. They've got a political component. They've got a economic component. There's a whole host of things going on here as a result. If you could help us unpack that question in addition to any other observations you might have.
Sure.
Or Andrew, the floor is yours, rather.
Mark, well, thanks for having me back here. And it's always great to be joined by new cast members at the Capitol Cable with Christy and Phil. So a pleasure to be here with you. I'll just quickly say that, everything what they said, I would agree with, and what Christy mentioned about the U.S.-Japan relationship and Trump being pleased. He had endorsed Takaichi beforehand. They had already developed a rapport, and he posted very quickly, I think, on Truth Social, how pleased he was with her win. I think that there can be, that's good sign for Washington. But of course, as Christy mentioned, he needs to deliver. And if they learn anything from the Koreans, just because you have a handshake agreement or a deal in place, it doesn't mean that you're completely out of the woods, because as we all know, U.S. has threatened Korea with tariffs, raising the reciprocal tariffs again from 15 to 25%. But in terms of Korea-Japan relations, you're absolutely correct, Mark. South Koreans have been watching this election just because of its implications for the South Korea-Japan relationship. And I want to take our listeners back to just last month, that image of Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee, drumming it out over a K-pop tune, playing Golden on K-pop Demon Hunters. The media said how this was, a really a charming, a very savvy, symbolic image of these two leaders trying to build trust, to build cooperation. But I don't think if you don't follow Korea or Japan, people don't realize how unthinkable this image would have been even a year ago. Because you have President Lee, who, for years had been saying stuff that's he'd been criticizing Japan. He's been demanding Japan for apologies, for compensation for wartime laborers. That's sort of the platform that he ran under. And then for Takaichi, she's known by Koreans as being like one of the most kind of far right-wing nationalist politicians. And so even for myself, like a year or two ago, I would have been very leery about her stepping up into the prime ministership. But it's amazing how much has changed in the past year. And so I want to say that it's not that Koreans all of a sudden are facing, a Japan that wants to, build up its military that takes on a stronger position when it comes to defense and security. I mean, this has been coming for years with Japan. And I think South Korea, since, especially with the rapprochement that President Yoon, move forward with Prime Minister Kishida from 2022, I think we've seen that gradually build up. I think what's been, from a Washington perspective, what's been great is that we've seen that continue under President Lee. So I will say that, certainly South Korea wants to see, I mean, they're trying to keep the relationship future oriented. They want to talk about cooperation. They're very pragmatic, as President Lee would say, about Korea-Japan relations and the U.S.-Japan-Korea trilateral relationship, as long as it's focused on deterrence against North Korea and China. This can be strategically useful. I do think the one thing that we may have to be worried about is if, the things that kind of concern Koreans are constitutional revision, or if there's a hint that Japan's beefing up of its defense forces is tied in with national historical messaging, that might kick up a firestorm again. But I think Takaichi is really also trying to calibrate this well. Takashima Day, Dokdo Takashima, the dispute of the islets. Takashima Day is on February 22nd, so it's coming up very soon. But we've already seen Takaichi say that she's not going to send a cabinet minister to the celebration, which is what she said she would do a year ago when she was campaigning. So I think both sides are trying to move this relationship forward, to act cautiously, to not do anything that could create a disruption in Korea-Japan ties.
All right, outstanding. And I would just add just a quick note. I would even take your positive trajectory of the two countries back further. You'd say end of Lee Min-bok attempt, although it did not work, to effectuate the JSOMIA with Japan, right? Mm-hmm. And then you had Park Geun-hye with the Comfort Woman Agreement and JSOMIA on her at the end of her tenure as well. So pretty interesting stuff, Andrew. I think to your point, like there is a historical trend and then there's the leadership, and it's really interesting. Okay, so then take me through what does specifically on the economic piece, that as you mentioned, the tariffs are back up. You had a very good anecdote about you're not out of the woods yet, even if you have a handshake agreement. That applies obviously to our friends in Korea. You've got Japan in place, early deals coming, a leader that President Trump really likes personally. How does this impact the current trajectory of U.S. ROK economic relationships that are, I would say, in the middle of negotiations and or legislative action in Korea as well? Mm-hmm. You've had the National Assembly has to act. You have the Prime Minister visiting Washington. All of this happening in the last month or so. What does this do to that space between Washington and Seoul on the economic front?
Yeah. So on one hand, Korea and Japan, if we go back to last summer, faced a very similar situation where the United States, the Trump administration, wanted to see more investments, but then I think the difference is how they ended up structuring those investments. Where for South Koreans, in some ways they felt that they had a better deal and that they could structure the investments at $20 billion a year as kind of the max. That would be the maximum. And so the $350 billion that they had pledged wouldn't have to come, all at once. It wouldn't have to be dispersed by the time the Trump administration leaves. But what I think is now coming to haunt them a bit is that, as Christy mentioned, Japan has already put down a few deals, so the investment deals are moving forward. Whereas for South Koreans, they haven't moved ahead because the National Assembly has to pass some legislation to be able to structure this. And so for the Trump administration, I don't know if they've actually done this, but they could be saying, well, in Japan, they've already moved forward with the agreement, the investments are coming in. Korea, where are things going? We're still waiting for these investments. Get your act together. I do think National Assembly and the League government is trying to push these things forward, but of course there's other irritants in the trade relationship with non-tariff barriers, with the Platform Act on Digital Services. So these are things that Koreans are going to have to clear up. But I do think that it's possible the Trump administration could play off Korea and Japan, saying, "Look what Tokyo's doing. We want you to move more quickly and make this deal more frictionless. Take away some of the obstacles that are allowing us to move forward."
Okay, outstanding. Let me just ask one question, then I'm going to go back to Christy. Andrew, final question is on North Korea. Any change in North Korean posture with this election coming into focus, number one, and or the ramp up, which, as you noted, has been going on for a while in terms of defense spending in Japan? Do you think that's likely to change anybody's calculation in Northeast Asia, or are we just kind of past that at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually haven't seen what if North Koreans had come up with any statement after the Takaichi, after her electoral, her victory. But I don't think it really changes the situation there. North Korea is just continuing to do what it does. It's getting ready for its, party, every 4-year party congress, and the Workers' Party convening, and they're pushing ahead with their weapons capabilities, with their nuclear program. There's rumors about leadership succession now being more formalized with Kim Jue, but in terms of what they're doing in the region, we haven't seen any shift. If we take a step back, though, if we see Japan arming itself, South Korea is also going to raise its defense spending by 3.5%. But if the North Koreans are doing likewise and getting support from Russia, this is going to be a very heavily militarized region if it's not already. So that's something that we have to be mindful of moving forward.
That's a really interesting point. And then also, you can also throw in the civil nuclear question, right, which adds a little spice to that basket as well, right, in terms of the 1-2-3 agreement and all that good stuff with between Washington and Seoul.
Yeah, and so I'm assuming we're going to see more coordination, because the Japanese they already have a civilian nuclear agreement that's different from South Korea. But if Koreans are trying to push in that direction, but the question is what levels of cooperation then can U.S., Japan, and Korea move together on? And there are all sorts of scenarios that we could see on the nuclear front. So probably more to come in that space.
I was just going to watch that space, as a former UK High Commissioner who was my boss in one iteration of my career would say. So excellent. All right, Christy, over to you. Let me come back. We got about 15 minutes left, I think, by the clock, maybe a little less. But let's talk China for a second. That issue has loomed large, if I am reading the press correct, in Japan recently. Talk us through how this election may impact that, and then the overall impact on the region. And of course, then in the background is President Trump's potential visit to Beijing here later this spring. Christy, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, this is a complicated tangle of issues, but, essentially tensions have been, high between Japan and China since some comments by Prime Minister Takaichi late last year. She basically said in the Diet, in response to repeated questioning from an opposition party member, that a situation arising near Taiwan could result in a survival-threatening scenario for Japan, which then logically could trigger collective self-defense, et cetera. And so since that time, although she has clarified her statements as being consistent with Japanese government position for quite some time, et cetera, that hasn't really been accepted by Beijing, and there have been a number of ramp-ups in rhetorical pressure, in economic pressure, and coercion from China, in maritime activity around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, etc. So with Takaichi's victory, it's very unlikely that these will go away in the near future. Essentially, she's in place. She has a very strong mandate. So on one hand, perhaps that sends a signal to Beijing that the Japanese public has certainly not punished Takaichi for these statements. Actually, polls show that a majority of of people agreed with her statement on Taiwan after she made it. And if anything, some people actually believe that it made her more popular for taking a leadership stance. And on the China side, of course, with Taiwan being a core issue, they're unlikely to back down. So this is kind of a situation where we're expecting to see tensions continue for some time, like we have in similar flare-ups in the early 2010s between Japan and China. So what does that mean as we go forward? Well, of course, Japan and China are still major economic partners. Takaichi has said that she's willing to engage with China based on Japan's national interests, but that doesn't seem like there's any potential for very warm relations. So the big variable, of course, is U.S.-China relations. And when we think about Takaichi preparing for her expected summit with Trump in March, the timing of that is very strategically intended to be before Trump goes to meet with Xi. And, I'm sure she is hoping to frame his thinking on this issue and to remind him of the shared interests and concerns that the U.S. and Japan have vis-a-vis China. But of course, Trump has his own priorities when it comes to China and economic deals. I mean, I think bottom line, what we've seen with this administration is they have a high capacity to have contradictory policies at the same time. So he'll try to get a good deal with China. He'll, have strong relations with Japan. He won't see that as a problem, and he will, try to maneuver that. But it does mean that, potentially U.S.-China dynamics could shift things between Japan and China. For example, if we see really high tensions between the U.S. and China, I could see that maybe, be some incentive to de-escalate the other side. I mean, it's a complicated dance, but yeah, basically, I think we're in for tensions for the time being. When we think about Japan and China.
Gotcha. And this takes me back a little bit to even pre-Abe time about a dispute over senkakus that flared tensions, and eventually an off-ramp was found. Do you see an off-ramp here, or is this going to be kind of ride it out for the next several months and perhaps a big relationship, absent a relationship shift between Washington and Beijing or some sort of change, you're likely to just kind of see this status quo continue for the foreseeable future?
I don't really see an easy off-ramp in the near future. I think if we think about the earlier historical incidents that you were mentioning, these tensions can persist for months or years. And there are a lot of structural concerns and difficulties between Japan and China about, security issues, about all sorts of things. So, it's not easy to just resolve things or back down. And there's a lot of, reputational cost and signaling, et cetera, that plays into this. I think the things that could change, the thing is that, if there was a leadership change, if Takaichi had lost, that could have possibly been a reset.
Mm-hmm.
But now she's in a very strong position. She's going to strengthen Japan's security posture. She's going to increase cooperation with the U.S. and other regional allies and partners. So, I think that this is only going to lead to a situation where it's very hard to ease tensions. But again, I think the big variable is U.S.-China relations. And we've seen, I think, patterns where China doesn't really like to be at odds with both Japan and the U.S. at the same time. I think there is, a little bit of a kind of dance that they try to do there, but I don't think it's likely we'll see significant warming. Even before Takaichi came to office, we were only really seeing the beginning of a thaw under Ishiba. They temporarily removed a ban on seafood exports that was only removed for a few months and really didn't, have any substantive results. But things have been, chilly with China. They just haven't been, actively tense. So there's not really much of a basis for significant warming.
Okay, I'll thanks for that's. I was just going to come to you, Andrew, because I know you have a hard stop at 10:15. First, I was just going to say to Christy, thanks for taking on complex questions.
Sure.
We save the easy ones for Victor, but he's not here today. There you go.
I did
Andrew,
want
please.
to. Could I weigh in just a minute
please.
on what Christy had said? Because I absolutely agree. What's different from the Abe period, a decade or so ago, is that I think Japan and China are really dug in. There's this path dependency where China's it's much more powerful than it was even a decade ago, and they feel like they don't really need to be deferential to the U.S. as they may have been, or even with the China-Japan relationship, they may have been more dependent on Japan a decade ago than they are now. So they can kind of chart their own course, and same thing with Japan too. They're on this path where they're continuing to expand their military capabilities, that they want more offensive capabilities. They're aligning more strongly to the U.S. I think the only sort of off ramp is if there's like a Trump-Xi sort of truce and then the climate begins to change, maybe because the US is shifting, Takaichi may shift, but not, I don't think she would do anything in response to what, Beijing is doing. So I don't really see an easy off-ramp either, just because of these path dependencies have been taken by Beijing and Tokyo.
Let me ask one then quick. Go ahead. Go, Christy. Go.
I just want to underscore Andrew's point, but the security environment and the attitudes towards security in Japan have really dramatically changed over the last decade. So I think that's a really important point that he was making.
All right, outstanding. Andrew, one quick follow-up to you then to Phil for final thoughts. Andrew, I would be remiss if I didn't then follow up your intervention with a question about implications for South Korea. Lee Jae-myung just came back from China. Thoughts there in the midst of this Japan-China, I guess, tensions and an impending visit by President Trump this spring, implications for South Korea.
Yeah, so that's where I think Seoul and Tokyo, there is some gap. They do see some differences in China. I do think overall Koreans, the South Korean public is very anti-China still, but the Lee administration knows that it needs to maintain some semblance of a positive relationship because of the economic relationship, really. And so they want to get along with China, and they don't have the same beef that Tokyo currently has with Beijing. And so I feel that if, let's say, there was some kind of contingency or a crisis on the Taiwan Strait, Japan is more willing, much more forward-leaning, in supporting Taiwan. I'm not sure if South Korea would want to move in that same direction. And that's where you could maybe see some gaps between Tokyo and Seoul. So I do think there's room for coordination on China and kind of Indo-Pacific security, but there is some differences between the Lee government and Takaichi. And if so that's something to look out for, that if Japan is moving in a direction that Korea doesn't want to, that's going to make it very difficult for trilateral coordination or cooperation in confronting China.
All right, outstanding. And I would just add, in terms of big changes in the last 10 years, a theme we've developed here at the end of the program, the economic relationship between South Korea and China has changed dramatically, right? South Korean companies are not as integrated in the Chinese economy, for lack of a better word, than they were 10 years ago, right? It's still an important market, but it's very different in terms of their ability to sell into that market, their presence there, their facilities there. That has changed a lot in the last 10 years. I don't want to overstate it, but I think it's an important point to get on the record. All right. Yeah. Oh, since we're talking on economic issues, last word to Dr. Luck here. Phil, your thoughts on this piece that we developed here late in the episode, especially but not limited to the economic implications.
Yeah, and I totally agree that the attitudes in both Korea and Japan are changing quickly with respect to China, but also it's really important to note that Korea remains much more reliant on the Chinese market, and so it's a hugely important economic relationship. So there's going to be potentially differences between how they handle that. On the sort of economic coercion piece of this, this is something I've been tracking a lot. I mean, I think there's been a few things. I mean, obviously, one reason why I don't think there's a really good off ramp on the Japanese side is because you can't possibly walk back those statements. So again, they're basically a statement of essential policy, and that would be hugely reputationally challenging. Beijing can walk this back anytime they want. I mean, in some sense, if they were trying to affect politics in Japan, that clearly didn't work. Obviously, their audience could be more external, but it clearly is not working. Again, the sort of lighter levers they use, both the fishing, the sort of seafood ban and the tourism ban, those were really small economically. For one, because of the weak yen, tourism has been booming in Japan, so the tourism ban is not a really big deal for the most part. As Christy noted, they just, the seafood ban had been only unbanned for a few months, so it's really not that big a deal. And they've been able to sort of diversify to ASEAN countries pretty successfully. And I think broadly, people think about, China's just not a very sort of safe market to sell into, even though it can be profitable. The thing that could bite more is, of course, the rare earth bans. I haven't been able to see much impact yet, but I mean, that's obviously something you can track. To me, the bigger issue and the thing that I've been tracking more is the lack of a U.S. sort of vocal, high-level response to this coercion. Yes, there's this sort of potential, warming of relations between the United States and China, I think I'd be very surprised if we sort of have something really big and substantive in that lane. But even as important to that is just the United States not sort of even diplomatically showing up for partners when they're being actively coerced. I think China seems to feel like it has a little bit more of a free hand than maybe it has in the past. When I was in Tokyo in Japan in December, the lack of a full-throated U.S. response was noted. That said, after the election, the warm words of congratulation from the president, that's showing support for the administration. That's good. But again, I think this administration would do well to recognize that, if your partners feel fear of doing things that's in your interest or aligned with your interest because they don't feel that you're going to be support them if they get hit by Beijing, that's going to go against your interests in the long run. And that's something I'd love this administration to think more about.
All right, outstanding. And I would just add one thing to add to the point of in your interests. You have to clearly signal your interest. And in a previous episode, I think our last episode on the national defense strategy that was just put out by President Trump, there are 0 mentions of Taiwan, right? Yes. As our guest noted, which is pretty interesting too. So add that to the complex mix in the region. All right, outstanding work today. Thanks to everybody, all of our panelists here. Dr. Philip Luck, Christy Govella, and of course, or Dr. Christy Govella, Professor Christy Govella, and of course, Professor Dr. Andrew Yo. Really, really, really outstanding insights, analysis, commentary. We thank you for your time here today, and we'll definitely, if you're willing, have you back. So with that, gavel down on the latest episode of the CSIS Capital Cable, and we're just basically about a month from the start of KBO seasons. And Andrew, I'm happy to give you advice on which seats in Jamshil Stadium to sit in once again. All right, take care, everybody. Go Bears.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Thanks a lot.